Hello, it's Mundo Monday and it's February. And February is Black History Month, celebrating stories of people of African descent. That place on the back of my head. You may ask yourself, what is the point of Black History Month? Shouldn't people study history regardless of race or ethnicity or skin color? Why is there no White History Month? The answer to all these questions is why we have Mundo Monday. There are so many kinds of people in the world, and every single person has their own unique story to tell. Unfortunately, not everyone has had the same opportunity to tell their stories. In the United States, society has been under the control of white Protestant men for so long that history books, and books, movies, and media in general, have focused on the exploits of white Protestant men, and occasionally white Protestant women, and occasionally someone of another ethnicity or culture, but mostly only when those people have some effect on the stories of white Protestant men. Consequently, the stories of all the other types of people have gotten drowned out. So, the reason there is no White History Month is that every month has been White History Month, and the reason we have days or weeks or months to highlight other stories? Well, let's hear that answer from the father of Black History Month himself, Carter G. Woodson. Carter reads the newspaper, written by Deborah Hopkinson, illustrated by Don Tate. You can see there's a whole bunch of people on the end pages. Each February, we celebrate Black History Month. It's a time to honor heroes like Harriet Tubman, Rosa Parks, and Martin Luther King Jr. But there's one hero we sometimes forget. Carter G. Woodson didn't help people escape from slavery or start a bus strike or lead a movement of millions, yet without him, we might not have Black History Month. This is his story. Carter was born on a small farm in Virginia in 1875, 10 years after the end of the Civil War. Carter's parents, James Henry and Ann Eliza, were born into slavery, and Carter grew up hearing all about their lives. The stories they told weren't part of any history book, but Carter kept them in his heart. James Henry, his father, had run away from his master to join the Union Army and fight for freedom. Times are hard, though. After the war, James Henry worked on the railroad, saving enough to buy a few acres of worn-out land. Most years, the crops brought in $100 or yet less. Ann Eliza was unbelievably brave. When she was a girl, her master decided to sell her mother. Ann Eliza asked him to sell her instead. That way her mother wouldn't have to leave her other 5 children. But no one offered enough money for Ann Eliza, so her master sold her mother and 2 little brothers instead. Ann Eliza didn't see them again until after the Civil War. She never forgot the horror of standing on that auction block. Carter's parents struggled to feed and clothe their 7 children. Especially in winter and early spring, food was scarce. Carter, the youngest, once said, "We would leave the table hungry to go to the woods and pluck the persimmons." Many times he had to jump into bed early on Saturday nights so his mother could watch his only pants and shirt for church the next day. Carter could only attend school 4 months each year. The rest of the time he was needed to work on the farm. Learning didn't happen just at school, though. James Henry taught his children to stand up for themselves, take pride in who they were. He gave Carter the courage to look anyone in the eye and declare, "I am your equal." And though Carter's father couldn't read or write, he believed in being an informed citizen. So he asked Carter to read the newspaper to him. But newspapers weren't easy to come by. Sometimes Carter read from old ones that had been used to wrap up food or packages. But reading the newspaper gave Carter his first glimpse of the wider world. Carter longed to go to high school, but his family needed him to earn money. When he was 15, he hired himself out to nearby farms, working long hours under the hot sun. He also drove a garbage wagon. High school would have to wait. Carter's older brother Robert found good-paying work in the coal mines of West Virginia. Carter decided to join him there. Mining was grueling work for a boy not yet 17. It was dangerous. Once a piece of slate came crashing down on Carter's head. He never forgot his time in the mines. Years later, Carter said, "I am a coal miner, and I can take anything." We have a lot of coal mines in this area. Do you know anyone who is or was a coal miner? My grandfather was a coal miner, and he was as young as Carter when he started working in the mines. In this harsh place, Carter met a man named Oliver Jones. You'll have to look hard to find Oliver's name in a history book, but in that small mining camp in Fayette County, West Virginia, Oliver did something important. He changed one life, Carter's, and that life changed many. Like Carter's father, Oliver was a Civil War veteran who believed in education. As a soldier who'd been at the Battle of Appomattox on the final day of the Civil War, Oliver had fought for freedom and equality. He was still willing to do his part to further the cause, said Carter. Each evening, after working in the mines, Oliver threw open the doors of his little house to all the other miners. He made his home a reading room, filling it with books by African American writers and with newspapers from all over the country. He sold ice cream and fruits, all at prices the men could afford. At first, Carter just went for the food, but that changed. Carter said, "When Oliver Jones learned that I could read, he soon engaged me to inform him and his friends as to what was in the daily newspapers." Carter was happy to oblige. He liked reading the newspaper. Besides, he said later, "I always enjoyed the nice things to eat." Carter admired Oliver. He was a well-educated man, but he could still neither read nor write, said Carter. He learned through others. And Carter began to learn in the same way. Carter had longed for school. Life at Oliver's tea room turned out to be school of a different kind. Whenever Oliver and the other miners had questions about something Carter read in the newspaper, it was Carter's job to research the answers. If a Civil War veteran was in the news, Oliver wanted to know all about the man. "I had to look him up in the books, inform my friends as to what battles he'd fought," said Carter. If there was a question about economics, politics, or a new law, it was up to Carter to find out all about it in the newspaper and explain it to his friends. Carter was inspired by Oliver and this circle of men committed to freedom, equality, and knowledge, men whose own life stories would never be in the history books. And so the seeds of Carter's own life work began to grow. My interest in penetrating the past of my people was deepened. Carter worked in the mines for 3 years. When he was 20, he moved home to Virginia to start high school. He finished in just 2 years. Carter went on to college and became a teacher, and he continued to study and work, earning a master's degree when he was 33. Then when Carter was 37, he earned a PhD in history from Harvard University, the second African American to do so. W.E.B. Du Bois was the first. Carter was the first and only Black American whose parents had been slaves to receive a doctorate in history. At Harvard, so the story goes, one of Carter's professors said that black people had no history. Carter remembered his father's pride, his mother's courage, and Oliver's determination to learn. He remembered reading the newspaper. Carter spoke up. "No people lack a history," he said. The professor challenged Carter to prove him wrong. And so for the rest of his life, Carter did just that. In 1926, he established Negro History Week, which later became Black History Month. Carter chose the second week of February to mark the birthdays of Frederick Douglass, a noted abolitionist and scholar, and Abraham Lincoln, who was the president, signed the Emancipation Proclamation that ended slavery. They were also good friends. We got that book here too, I think. Today, our entire nation celebrates Black History Month, and we honor Dr. Carter G. Woodson as the father of Black history. But in 1926, Carter was alone with his new idea. He had to blaze a trail. He had to spread the word at a time when there were no computers or internet or televisions. So Carter sent pamphlets about Negro History Week out to schools, colleges, churches, and women's clubs. And of course, he sent notices to newspapers. The boy who began by reading the newspaper to others transformed the way people thought about history. He fought for a history based on truth, a history that includes all people. Carter G. Woodson didn't just study history, he changed it. And we can too. No people lack a history, isn't that what I always say? Absolutely. Everyone has a story to share, and history is stories. It's right there in the name. Do you remember when we read about Kwanzaa? We talked about how Black Africans whose ancestors had been brought to America as slaves had lost their cultures from Africa? That wasn't because they didn't have cultures. It was because the slave owners in charge wouldn't let them have their old cultures. And that's why Dr. Karenga created Kwanzaa, so they could reconnect with their African cultures. Likewise, it wasn't that Black Americans didn't have history, it was that no one bothered to let them share their history. So the majority of Americans never learned it. I grew up in a very white community, and all the stories I heard were mostly white too. I knew about Harriet Tubman and Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, just like it says in the front of the book, and that was about all I knew. One of my first jobs as a librarian was in a middle school that was about half white and half black kids, so they had a little bit more variety, a little bit more diversity compared to the school where I grew up, and so did the books in their library. I was helping the students to find information for reports on influential people from history, and one girl had chosen to do her report on Madam C.J. Walker. Madam C.J. Walker. I'd never heard of her, so I wasn't sure where to begin. Sure enough, she had an amazing story. She built her own company in the early 1900s when most companies were run by men, let alone white men. And she was selling beauty products, especially formulated for Black women, and was the first American woman, period, to become a self-made millionaire. She earned all her money from scratch. She didn't inherit it. And look, she's in this book too. Under her birth name, Sarah Breedlove, C.J. Walker was her husband's name. She was Mrs. or Madam C.J. Walker. And look at all these other people I've never learned about. We got Sarah Breedlove here. Well, I did know about Sojourner Truth and George Washington Carver. She was an abolitionist and women's rights activist. He was a biologist who invented many new uses for farm crops. And I've heard of W.E.B. Du Bois, though I
couldn't have told you anything about him.
Like the book says, he is a historian like Carter Woodson, and he actually got his doctorate first.
I don't know anything about Rebecca Lee Crumpler.
She was the first official African-American female doctor. She specialized in treating women and children.
What about Peter Salem?
Revolutionary War hero at the Battle of Bunker Hill.
Louis Latimer?
He made light bulbs work better and invented an early air conditioner.
Mary McLeod Bethune. No, I've heard of her.
Well, you should have. She did everything from founding schools to advising President Franklin D. Roosevelt.
And Ida B. Wells, she was a journalist.
Who used journalism to expose injustice and champion civil rights.
Oh, and the people in the this section too. Some of these are covered up. I can't tell who's out on the edge there.
It appears to be Queen Nzinga of the Mbundo people of Ndongo and Matamba in the 16th century, what is now Angola. She kept Portuguese invaders from taking over her land and people. And on the other side of her is the ancient Egyptian pharaoh Taharka.
So we got Hannibal Barca here.
Ancient general of Carthage, which is now Tunisia. His military strategies were so good every army he battled, including the Roman Empire, started copying them.
Queen Amina.
A Hausa warrior queen from Zazzau, now Nigeria, who became a folk hero.
Mansa Musa.
Sultan of the Mali Empire, who may have been the richest person in the history of the world, adjusted for inflation.
Joseph Zink
led the revolt against the slave ship Amistad.
Phyllis Wheatley, I've heard of her, she's a poet.
Not just any poet, but published at 14 while she was enslaved and had only learned English 6 years before.
Edmonia Lewis,
sculptor in the mid-1800s, who was one of the first African Americans to gain international fame as an artist.
Dred Scott. Well, I've heard of Dred Scott. There's something legal.
Yes, he sued for his family's freedom from slavery.
Yeah.
When the Supreme Court ruled against him, it inflamed the abolitionist movement.
Nat Turner. Oh, I've heard of him too.
He led the most successful slave rebellion in the United States.
Elijah McCoy?
The real McCoy! That's where it comes from. He invented lubricators for steam engines.
Booker T. Washington.
Heard of him. Founded the Tuskegee Institute. Great African-American cultural leader. He was like the W.E.B. Du Bois of the South. Du Bois, he says Du Bois.
Francis Harper?
Abolitionist and suffragist, and one of the first black women to publish a novel.
Marcus Garvey.
He's a complicated one. He encouraged black folks all around the world to rise up and have a sense of pride. But he was also a bit of a fascist who thought he should be king of all Africa. Still, he had very influential ideas.
What about on the other side? Oh, these ones are a little more recent. I've heard of most of these ones, like Maya Angelou. She's a poet too. She's a writer. I've read her. I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings.
One of the first poetic autobiographies.
And Marian Anderson. One of my first lessons I taught when I was student teaching was about Marian Anderson. She was an opera singer and she had a very low voice.
Mm-hmm.
Coretta Scott King. We talked about her the other week.
And her book award. By the way, this year's Coretta Scott King Awards went to illustrator Frank Morrison for RESPECT, Aretha Franklin, the Queen of Soul, by Carol Boston Weatherford, which Miss Amy is about to mention in this very video in a minute or so. And the author award went to Before the Ever After, a middle grade novel by Jacqueline Woodson, whom we just spent a whole Mundo Monday episode on last fall for back to school.
Muhammad Ali, the greatest
boxer, and also a great activist and role model.
Shirley Chisholm,
the first black woman in Congress and the first woman of any race to ever run for president.
Mae Jemison. We've got some books by her in the library. She's an astronaut.
That's because, as well as being the first black female astronaut, she also started educational initiatives to encourage research into long-term space travel.
Charles Drew.
He invented blood banks, storing blood to use in transfusions.
We got a book about him too. Malcolm X.
One of the most outspoken civil rights activists of the 1960s.
Katherine Johnson. Hidden Figures. We got several books about her.
She calculated flight trajectories for NASA.
Duke Ellington. Sir Duke. That's Stevie Wonder. He's another great black American. I'm getting ahead of myself.
No, more stories are good. So, Stevie Wonder wrote a song about the Jazz Age, including famed band leader and pianist Duke Ellington. Many people's stories go on to influence the stories of everyone who comes after them.
Zora Neale Hurston. You know, we have a couple of books in the juvenile fiction section that are about Zora Neale Hurston as a little kid solving mysteries.
That's probably because she was such a keen observer of humanity. She took what she observed and wrote it, and became such a celebrated author that they called her Queen of the Harlem Renaissance.
Colin Kaepernick. He's a
Football player who started the Take a Knee
Black Lives Matter dude.
To protest police violence, that is.
Jesse Owens is awesome.
4-time Olympic gold medalist in track and field, the fastest man in the world in 1936.
Yeah, that was when they were up against the Nazis and Hitler was like, oh, the white people are the best people in the world, and then Jesse Owens went and blew them all away. It's cool.
Yes, it is. The current fastest man in the world is a black Jamaican, Usain Bolt, a lightning name for lightning speed. You can't see, but under the flap is also noted author Richard Wright.
I can see this is the Michelle Obama here, and there must be her husband under here too. Yeah, Barack Obama, the first black president. And now we have the first black vice president, Kamala Harris, who is also our first female vice president and our first South Asian American vice president. She's mixed race.
It's about time for all those things. Think what great leaders Queens Amina and Nzinga were in the 1500s.
We have so many cool biographies here about African Americans and other black people who've made history that this doesn't even begin to name them all. What about Matthew Henson, the first man to reach the North Pole?
Nelson Mandela, who led the fight against apartheid in South Africa?
Jackie Robinson, who desegregated Major League Baseball.
Or Satchel Paige, the first player to have played in the Negro Leagues who went on to pitch in the Major League World Series.
Josh Gibson, he played for Pittsburgh in the Negro Leagues. Oh, and August Wilson, very famous playwright from Pittsburgh, had a whole series of plays all set in Pittsburgh that are considered classics by people who don't even live anywhere near
Literary
Pittsburgh.
greats like Langston Hughes.
Wait. Chuck Berry, Bo Diddley, Sister Rosetta Tharpe, the inventors of rock and roll.
W.C. Handy started them all off with the blues.
Berry Gordy, freaking Motown Records. How many Motown artists too, like Smokey Robinson or Aretha Franklin?
What about military heroes like the
Jimi
Tuskegee
Hendrix,
Airmen?
the greatest rock guitarist of all time.
Him too.
Bob Marley, the reggae king. He wasn't African American, he was African Jamaican.
Like Usain Bolt.
DJ Kool Herc, inventor of hip hop. Got his book here too. And the lady who started the Sugar Hill Gang?
Sylvia Robinson?
Yeah.
Not to
First
mention the
rap
Sugar
record.
Hill Gang themselves.
And further back, jazz musicians, Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker, Ella Fitzgerald, Sun Ra,
But
Scott Joplin.
you don't know there's more to black history than musicians, right?
I really like music.
Maybe we should branch out a bit.
Well, Josephine Baker was a singer and a spy.
Bass Reeves, Wild West lawman and inspiration for the Lone Ranger.
How about Bessie Coleman, one of the world's first stunt pilots?
Garrett Morgan, who invented the street light, and Lonnie Johnson, who invented the Super Soaker.
Honestly, we could keep going here for a very long time. There's so many great stories to discover, too many to fit into just 1 month of the year. Why can't every month be Black History Month? And everyone else's History Month too.
Sure, in an ideal world, there would be no need for Black History Month or any other history month. Everyone's stories would get to be heard without need of a calendar reminder. But until then, we need to make an effort to find those seldom heard stories and lift them up to be seen and heard. And here at Mundo Monday, that's what we do. Make sure everyone's stories are shared. Until next time. My wrist hurts.